During the pandemic, and with little control over our daily lives, I was lucky to be able to take my son to the woods. We learned the names of trees, watched the seasons pass, and foraged food.
Daddy, these are all right, aren't they? Daddy, these are all right, aren't they? But this one's still small, isn't it?
This unique time allowed us to connect with nature deeply and locally. Rather than seeing images of distant icebergs melting and forest fires, we witnessed the plight of the ash and oak trees. We trod the few public paths available and longed to swim in the private rivers on hot days. Despite the gloom, exploring wild places gave us a sense of hope and made us remember our connection to the natural world. I thought about all we derive from nature and what is at stake when we lose this connection. This film will journey across Britain, discussing the most urgent issues affecting our landscape and the people doing extraordinary work to change things. In Scotland, I met Alan Watson Featherstone, the founder of Trees for Life, who for the past 30 years has dedicated his life to restoring the Caledonian forest.
In the 60s, a visionary forester, a man called Finlay McRae, had gone out on a limb and had fenced off a big section of the old forest here, just to see what would happen. And of course, as soon as the deer and sheep were kept out, all the naturally occurring seedlings were free to grow, and this whole new forest had sprung up. And it was remarkable, the transformation. On a day trip, somebody organised a busload of people to come to Glenafric. And as we got into the glen, came up this winding road past a river with cascading waterfalls and old trees with lichens and mosses hanging off them like curtains. Big mountains, lochs, rivers, and a big forest. And it reminded me of Canada. And I was amazed, because growing up in Scotland, like so many people, I thought the natural state of Scotland was the treeless expanses, the open views of the glens, the heather-covered moors, and the grassy areas with no trees in sight. So I began coming out here regularly, and I began to develop a connection with this landscape. And I saw two things. One was I saw that the forest was dying. The trees were all old, and there were no young trees growing to take their place. I call this an outdoor museum. We go to museums to see dead relics of the past, and there's no living trees here today. And that's because of the management of this land over centuries. 30,000 sheep in this glen for 150 years or more, and large numbers of deer. And they have removed any seedlings that regenerated naturally in that time. There's no predators to move them around or to pick off the old and the weak, to keep them on the move. And in the absence of trees that hold the soil in place, the erosion has exposed the peat. And it's like an open wound in my hand if, I break my skin and the bare flesh is exposed. This is the bare flesh of the earth here. These trees would have been 25, maybe 30 meters tall in their prime, full of life. And now it's a wasteland. This is very typical of the Caledonian forest remnants. And look around, you see these beautiful old trees here, Scots pines, different shapes, different sizes. But if you look, you'll notice there's something missing. There's no young trees. These are all old trees here, 200 years old, sometimes older than that. There are actually seedlings here. I'm standing next to two of them right below me. They reach the height of the heather and the surrounding vegetation. They get eaten by deer until they die. And that's been happening for 200 years. So that's the issue I became aware of in the 1980s, and I felt this woodland, this forest, was calling out for help. There was no voice or message, but it was the feeling I got. I could see it, the forest was dying. And every time I came out, I'd see another tree that had broken limbs or, had died at the top or whatever, naturally. And I could see projecting forward a few decades, that's more than 30 years ago now, a few decades, it would get worse and worse. So that's what inspired me to take action here. Deer management is a complex subject which, is in the hands of landowners, and it's not easy to change. Much easier to put up fences and keep deer out, and then the trees grow by themselves. Now, this area is called Athnamulloch 1. It was the first fence put up here, funded by the Forestry Commission themselves, as it was then in 1990, and 65 hectares of land, and there were no mature trees visible in this view at all. There was a few on the far side, a few birches, no living pines when the fence went up. Trees for Life started planting. Our volunteers began work here in 1991. In April we planted 5,800 Scots pines, and the following year we came back and planted another 10,000 or so. We've got a healthy, restored natural forest here, which is variable. There's no two places that look alike. And I always say, the test for me is whether our work will be successful or not is in 50 years' time, people will come here and they will not be able to tell that this was planted. It will look like a natural forest. Then we've been successful.
Virginia McKenna and Will Travers are the co-founders of the Born Free Foundation. They have worked tirelessly to ensure that all wild animals, whether living in captivity or in the wild, are treated with compassion and respect and are able to live their lives according to their needs.
The thing we do with humans who transgress the norms and standards of society is we lock them up. And we take away the thing that we perhaps value above all else, freedom. But we put animals in captivity and lock them up for life for entertainment.
Why do we think of them differently from human beings? I never understood the division between our attitude to our own species and other species, because we admire wild creatures in so many ways. We're always saying, oh, isn't it fantastic? The pride of lions, look at all the cubs, or the herd of elephants, look at the babies, isn't the mother caring? And yet, we still can treat them as if they're unfeeling, not sentient in any way. And we keep animals that live in groups or families alone. We don't have any respect for who they are.
If the pandemic has taught us one thing and shown us one thing, it's that we have been hurtling towards an irreversible end of life as we know it. And now we have this opportunity to take a beat, to take a step back, to engage reverse gear. It's how can we be more intelligent as a species on behalf of the whole planet and all its inhabitants? How can we be more fair, more equitable in the way we treat each other and the way we treat all other living creatures to get us away from the edge of the cliff? And that's going to mean some big changes, and we're going to have to embrace them. The import and shooting of 40 million pheasants and partridges every year. It's an alien species. It's not a species that's found in this country. We don't know the impact that it has on our own native wildlife. Just here, I mean literally just here, in the field over there, they've sown corn. They're growing it as cover and food for pheasants. Some people will then come and blast out of the sky by the hundred for fun. Is perverse. The last wolf disappeared from the United Kingdom towards the end of the 1700s. There are those who want to reintroduce wolves to certain parts of Scotland, for example. We have a pathological attitude towards wolves, as exemplified by, Little Red Riding Hood and werewolves. We have created a monster of our own imagination that surrounds wolves, and we will mete out retribution if the wolves ever kind of get in our way. But that's not really the real relationship that human beings have with wolves. And actually, to put it all the way back to zoos, what zoos do is they create an unnatural relationship between human beings and dangerous wild animals. There was advertising at one major British zoo that was based around a photograph of a tiger and a child, and it said, "We'll take you to within an inch of your life." That kind of vicarious pleasure of putting yourself in a position that would represent massive risk, but don't worry, you'll be safe, is not the real relationship that wild creatures have with humanity. The real relationship that we have with wild creatures that could be dangerous is one of self-defense or flight or respect or leave alone, but it's not putting yourself up close and personal.
Once resident in the UK, the lynx is thought to have become extinct during the medieval period around 1300 years ago. By preying on deer, lynx, like wolves, could restore ecological processes missing for centuries. On Derek Gow's farm in Devon, you can get a glimpse of a Britain long forgotten. He's successfully worked with native species such as the lynx and beaver, advocating for their reintroduction. Over the last 25 years, he has released 25,000 water voles and dozens of beavers, dramatically affecting the surrounding landscape.
Well, things like beavers are incredibly important to a landscape because what beavers do is they are nature's water gardeners. They hold water on the land and they hold water in different shapes on the land, if you like. So you get pools, you get canals, they re-engineer landscapes to be wet so they can swim out from their central water bodies, from their lodges where they're sleeping at night, out into the surrounding environment to feed on herbs, grasses, trees or shrubs. And in doing so, by creating these great wetlands, what they do is they provide living space for other things, for the frogs, for the insects, for the fish, for the otters that come to hunt the fish, for the kingfishers that come to hunt the fish. Every guild of life responds to beavers, so what you end up with when you accept beavers back into your life is you end up with an 80% greater breadth of new nature, other things finding a foothold in a home, and then much more of them. So there are 80% more water beetles, 80% more fish. So what beavers do is they breathe life back into landscapes that are dead, and that's why they're so critically important.
Beavers have thrived on the River Otter, and as a result, they've reduced flood damage by slowing river systems. At the same time, pollution levels have dropped by filtering pollutants and made this landscape more resilient to climate change. It has been proposed that the flood damage we see each year in the UK would be less severe with the reintroduction of beavers.
The future for the beavers in Britain is bright. At the end of it all, the vast majority of people who think about them at all want them to be here. That support goes right to the top of government now. They are going to change everything. What we're doing by reintroducing beavers is we're not just adding another animal, to a list of creatures that live here. What we're doing is we are bravely giving nature the opportunity to change the landscapes we killed and for this miraculous creature to breathe life back into them.
Nick Hayes, the author of the Book of Trespass, is campaigning to extend the Right to Roam Act, which currently excludes the general public from over 90% of the English landscape.
In England, we've got 117,000 miles of footpath. A lot of people wedded to the orthodoxy believe that that constitutes enough. But I did the maths, and 117,000 miles of footpath is approximately 0.3% of the landmass of England. Because of the Countryside and Rights of Way Act, which came in the year 2000, we're now allowed access to another 8% of England, which leaves 92% private or out of bounds, not for your average Joe. A lot of people say if you want to go walking over in someone's private property, does that mean that you want someone coming in and invading your back garden? And it's a kind of understandable perspective because that's the way the law makes it seem. Like the law of trespass equates walking in 12,000 acres of Oakland the same thing as hopping over someone's back garden. But the truth is they're palpably different. We, the public, physically, mentally need access to the nature that is on our doorstep, that's all around us, because of the proven benefits to our mental health, to alleviate stress, depression, anxiety, but also physically to help us alleviate the symptoms of our sedentary lifestyles. The elephant in the room is that what we should really be looking at is not paying for costly schemes to encourage people to go out, but just simply eliminating what's called exclusive dominion, which is if I happen to own 20,000 acres, me and me alone have the right to wander it, to swim in the river that cuts through it, and no one else, not one single other person that we haven't given permission to, is allowed to access that land. We're surrounded by European countries that all have their version of a right to roam, a kind of ancient contract with the land that basically says as long as you owe a responsibility, a care, an active engagement with the health of the environment, then you should have the right to engage with it physically, to be there. So many people flocked to Bournemouth Beach, and what a bunch of COVID-idiots they were. But the truth is, people are used to going to the beach because we've kind of been trained that is an acceptable form of recreation. That's where you're allowed to be. But how many rivers, how many woodlands did they drive by? How many meadows just on their front doorstep they ignore to get to the one place that is kind of part of the kind of social fabric? You know, when you're on holiday, when the sun's out, you go to the beach. If you're lucky enough, like we are at the moment, to live on the Thames, there is a feeling of it just almost like otter cub joy to this kind of bubbling excitement on the riverbanks. But there are so many rivers in England, 97% of the rivers in England, the public are banned from. So when those people drove to Bournemouth Beach, they'd quite literally forgotten the joys of a river because the majority of them have barely swum in them. And then people don't want to swim in the rivers because they're filthy. The scandal, the kind of breathtaking, cavalier attitude of water companies allowing sewage to spill into our rivers, not least the chicken farms, the industrial agriculture runoff, the filth that is flowing through our rivers, has made people feel that rivers are a disgusting place to be. And it's urgent because our rivers are the key indicator of the health of the land around it. So rather than accepting our rivers as sewage pipes, we should be actively participating with the rivers. If you don't want to go in the river, then paddleboard on top of it and see for yourself, and then bloody do something about it.
As a child, my dad often took me to Wales. We would climb Mount Snowdon and swim in the ice-cold waterfalls running off the mountain. These are some of my most precious memories. A seed was planted in me with a deep love for nature. As an adult, I've always felt a need to go back to these places and explore nature wherever possible. I subconsciously connected to this environment without examining why it was so important. In recent years, my dad, suffering from chronic arthritis, has struggled to walk, caging his once adventurous body. Following a hip replacement surgery, he vowed to do all he could to recover. Cold water therapy was suggested for its physiological effect in rehabilitation. The cold water soothed his joints and liberated his body from pain. Watching life rush back through his body in the glacial waters of Llyn Padan reminded me of how we used to be. I was invited to the Isle of Mull to spend time with Nick Ray, an expeditionary sea kayaker and a vocal advocate for mental health and suicide awareness. Nick lives with treatment-resistant depression and is a suicide attempt survivor.
I do think it's important that everybody really has some way of connecting to wild places or to natural spaces. But I don't think it's necessary for people to have to do what I do. I don't think people have to go sea kayaking for 10 days and explore the wild west coast of Scotland or wherever it may be in the world. I think it's a place where people feel comfortable. It's a place where people feel at home. It could be anywhere really, and I think it's somewhere where, as a human, we can walk into, remain human, but feel more deeply connected to our natural landscape and therefore to our natural selves. And I think that's what's so important really. And that's what is so important for me is coming out here and acknowledging my humanness, but also acknowledging my place in the world.
Fantastic. Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Oh, brilliant.
I was struggling at the time anyway, and I was feeling very depressed and was talking of suicide. So I was asked to go to hospital, and because we live in Tobermory, we have to drive to the ferry and then get on the ferry and then travel across to the mainland. And I felt a complete failure, and I felt a complete burden and a waste of space. And when we got to the ferry, just knew that on the journey across to Oban, I was going to jump from the ferry. It was just a very calm decision. I just said to my wife, I'm off to the loo. I just walked out onto the deck and found a quiet place where there was nobody around and very calmly stepped over the edge and jumped into the sea and didn't feel any fear. There was no second thoughts, there was no regret. The ship just went past me and I was tossed around in the wake. And like I've been saying about immersing myself in nature, it just seemed like the most natural place for me to be, and I wasn't frightened and I was ready. The sea was cold and I got hypothermia. And I began to drift off. But then 20 minutes after I jumped, the siren on the boat went and my attempt had been seen, or somebody heard the splash or something like that. And so a rescue was put in place and I was eventually found and basically just brought back to life again, and then admitted to psychiatric ward for a prolonged 3-month stay. I think I'm most comfortable in a remote and wild setting. I feel I can be myself, which is really important for me, because I do struggle with my sense of self at times. I live with chronic depression, and it really impacts my life at times. But being out here and being able to access this incredibly peaceful, wild landscape enables me to calm myself and to feel that I belong somewhere. It's a really good way of me grounding myself.
I'm always an optimist. I always believe that in the end, however far away that end is, that human beings, most of them are humane beings. And I think this strange time that we've been living through has opened many people's, not only their eyes, but their soul, their heart. They're feeling more for nature. These wonderful little signs, particularly with children, who are so perceptive and so keen to get the message of our relationship with the natural world spoken about, acted upon. I'm in awe of young people. I think that they inspire me absolutely 100%.
So back in March 2020, we distributed, as mad as this might sound, 50,000 Cecil Oak acorns to all the Glasgow primary schools, because we wanted them to feel connected to nature, but also to feel like they had a voice when it came to COP26, and they felt that they had some interaction with that. So they could grow their wee oak trees along and then create a woodland and rewild their city. And then we gathered all those wee trees up, and like here we have today, over 1 week in early October, a little delegation from each of the Glasgow primary schools coming out onto the site and planting their wee trees. The natural environment doesn't stand separate from us. It weaves through so much of our lives, and that's what we're trying to demonstrate when the kids come out here. And it really resonates to what Greta Thunberg has been saying to these young voices. No one is too small to make a difference. And that is the heart of what we are doing as a project. Something that's really inspiring and something that's, that can energize us, that we can get ourselves out of this climate crisis. And that's what we wanted to continually do with the kids. It's not to kind of weigh them down and kind of the doom and gloom of it. It's just, these are the actions that you can get on board and make a difference.
Freedom to roam, for me, is about freedom to live the life that is based on my highest values, that has respect and care for others, but is also nurturing and fulfilling for me as an individual. And it's not just freedom to roam in terms of wandering over the land, it's freedom of a Scots pine here to grow, not constrained by its neighbours in a plantation so it looks like a giant matchstick with no side branches, but actually has a beautiful shape as an individual, as each human being is. It's freedom for wolves to roam, not be kept in zoos. Freedom for salmon, one of the most iconic species on the planet. We make these heroic journeys. We take those creatures and we put them in cages in the sea and raise them for food. Freedom for people to be able to go where they want and to do something meaningful with their lives. To not become, as Pink Floyd said, just another brick in the wall. And more young people, I think, are recognizing that and choosing to do that. They're not conforming, they're not following the standard career path. They're saying, I want to make a positive contribution. The planet depends on it. So imagine a world where everybody followed their heart and did their thing they felt most passionate about, that made a positive contribution, that touched and inspired other people. Imagine a planet of 7.8 billion people doing that. That's the world I want to create. That's the world I want to pass on to future generations. And one with lots of healthy forests full of wildlife as well.